Every night, a father called home to read his children a bedtime story, until one night they vanished. Their mother was found unconscious, and the walls were smeared with blood-red words, "God has chosen. Blood will cleanse the lie." The police had one question: what kind of man keeps his family safe, then becomes the prime suspect in their disappearance? To prove the truth, he had to confront a past no one dared to remember. The phone rang at 8:45 p.m. The screen displayed the name, Chris. Sherry pressed the answer button and turned on the speakerphone. The two children pounced, vying for the phone. "Dad, I wrote the word Gavin today. And I did 30 push-ups." Chris's voice came through the speaker, deep and steady. "Great job, I'm so proud. Now let Dad tell you a story, then you need to go to bed early." Chris began reading a passage from The Boy Who Cried Wolf, his voice even and familiar. Sherry didn't need to look at the book. She knew exactly where he was. He always stopped at the part where the wolf really appeared, but no one believed him anymore. At that point, Garrett would wrinkle his nose. "That kid was so dumb, Dad. If I were one of the villagers, I wouldn't care either." Chris chuckled. "So, what's the lesson here? Don't lie, and don't bother people all the time." Sherry sat silently beside them, writing in a small journal on her lap. "He's not perfect, forgetful, messy, speaks dryly. But when he reads to the children, I hear something in his voice that makes me believe, as if even if the world were to collapse, our family would still be safe." Chris wished his children good night and hung up. Sherry turned off the speaker and kissed each of them on the forehead. The two children rolled into bed, asleep in less than 5 minutes. They trusted that voice, as she once had, and still did. Chris was a former Marine, now working as a security guard for a Christian organization. Because of the nature of his work, he often had to work the night shift, but he never missed reading a bedtime story to his children, one way or another. Dinner that evening was earlier than usual. Chris got home on time, a rare occurrence. Sherry made his favorite mushroom stew, and Garrett chattered away about school. "You know what, Mom? One of my friends said, my dad only knows how to fight to make money." Sherry paused mid-ladle. Chris looked up, still chewing. Garrett continued. "I told him my dad is a hero and doesn't hit anyone. But he kept saying, 'Soldiers fight, so your dad must fight a lot.'" Sherry smiled and ruffled her son's hair. "Your dad doesn't hit anyone. He protects people." Chris said nothing. He looked down and continued eating. Sherry glanced at her husband. Something flickered in his eyes, quiet and evasive. It wasn't the first time she'd seen it, but this time it was clearer. That evening there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Marlene, the neighbor who lived alone, stood there with a box of homemade cookies. "It's such a lovely evening. I thought some warm cookies would be nice. I wanted to see you all, your house. It's always so warm. Looking through the window makes me envious. It's like a family from a movie." Chris gave a polite smile and took the cookies. "Thank you. My wife will love them." "Not just your wife, but those two little ones too. I hear their laughter through the fence all the time." After Mrs. Marlene left, Sherry looked at her husband and asked softly, "How do you feel about being called a family from a movie?" Chris looked down at the box of cookies and shrugged. "We're a happy family in real life, because movies always end, but our family won't." Sherry was a little taken aback, but she didn't say anything. She knew her husband had old demons, but it had been so long, and he never let them interfere with the present. Before going to bed, Garrett sat up in bed and suddenly asked, "Dad, did Uncle Ronnie used to live here?" The question fell like a stone into a still pond. Chris, who was folding laundry, stopped. "Yeah, that's right. A long time ago when Dad was little." "So, where is he now?" Chris folded the laundry faster, avoiding his son's eyes. "He went far away. Grown-ups all have their own lives, you know." Garrett nodded as if he understood, but Sherry stood behind the door, listening to everything. She had never heard Chris mention Ronnie, not at their wedding, not when their children were born, not even a phone call home. The name was as if it had never existed, until a child asked. After everyone was asleep, Chris sat silently in the living room. The dim light of the nightlight cast his long shadow on the floor. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo album, its cover peeling. He flipped through the pages, wedding photos, photos of Sherry pregnant, then photos of the two children on their first day of school. The next to last page, an old photo of two boys sitting under a tree, their hair sun-bleached. One was Chris, grinning, his eyes sparkling. The other, shorter, thinner, sitting huddled to the side, his eyes as if wanting to disappear from the frame. Chris placed his hand on the photo. His fingers touched the other boy's face. "Where are you, Ronnie?" No one answered. Only a light wind whistled through the cracks in the door, like a sigh carried away by the wind. Before going to bed, Sherry sat by the window and added to her journal. "I used to think happiness was something permanent, but now I'm starting to see it's more like paint, glossy, but if you're not careful, it'll crack before you know it. Maybe it's because there are questions that children ask, that adults stay silent about." She closed the journal and looked toward the bed where her two children were sleeping peacefully. There was still laughter, storytelling, and small hands reaching for their mother in their dreams. But there was one thing she knew for sure. The silence in her husband's eyes wasn't peace. It was something else. The first letter arrived on a Monday morning, lying forlorn among the pile of advertising bills. Chris only glanced at it when he picked it up. No sender's address, no postmark. The piece of paper inside had no address, just a short line printed in smeared black ink. "God will punish the hypocrite." No further explanation, no identity, no direct threat. But it was enough to make Chris stand still for a long time after reading it. The thought crossed his mind that it was a letter from someone who opposed his organization's work, a not uncommon occurrence. But the words were cold, bitter, and very personal. Chris stuffed the piece of paper into his pocket. He didn't say anything to anyone. He didn't want Sherry to worry, especially when she was spending her time teaching Gavin to write capital letters and to read scriptures. In the evening, Sherry noticed that Chris was eating quickly, not looking at anyone during dinner, and constantly glancing at the phone on the shelf. "Is something wrong at work?" she asked. Chris just shook his head. "Number. I'm just tired. Maybe I'm not getting enough sleep." Sherry didn't ask any more questions, but her eyes followed her husband's every small movement, as if waiting for him to sigh so she would have a reason to worry. The next morning, Sherry was changing the sheets and cleaning the room when she found an envelope crumpled and tucked loosely under Chris's pillow. Curious, she opened it. Inside was the very piece of paper he had received yesterday. The printing was black, clearly from a regular printer, but the ink was smeared, and there were a few places that looked like they had been deliberately scratched. She read the sentence 3 times. She didn't understand the meaning, but her heart was beating fast for no reason. Sherry stared at the black words on the white paper, unsure if the feeling in her heart was worry or hurt. She sat there for a moment, then folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and quietly placed it on the bedside table, face down. But her hands were shaking, not because she feared the writer of the letter, but because the man lying next to her hadn't trusted her enough to share. She turned away, hiding her tearful eyes behind her lashes. If you can't share your fears, what kind of husband and wife are we? 3 days later, Garrett woke up in the middle of the night, screaming and calling for his mother. Sherry ran into the room. Garrett was trembling, sweat soaking the back of his shirt. Someone was at the window. I saw them standing there, not saying anything, just watching me. Sherry quickly turned on the light and pulled back the curtains. There was no one there. But as she held her son in her arms, she felt it clearly. Garrett wasn't making it up. The boy was shaking as if he had really seen something. The next morning, Sherry took Garrett to school, but he refused to leave the car. He sat there hugging his backpack, his eyes constantly looking at the trees near the gate. "Don't you want to go to class?" Sherry asked. "It's safer at home, Mom. There are no alarm bells at school." The answer made Sherry feel numb. The child she thought was too young to understand already knew what insecurity was. Chris was no longer reassuring as before. The story of Garrett's dream made him silent, his eyes looking down at the floor. He was losing control, and he knew it. When Sherry asked directly, "Do you think the children are making it up?" he didn't answer. Sometimes silence is louder than words, and it made Sherry's blood run cold. That weekend, another letter arrived, still an envelope with no sender. But this time, the words inside made Sherry unable to remain silent. "Sherry, Garrett, Gavin, everything is a lie. Each of you will pay. God has seen everything." The writing was scrawled, as if typed with the left hand or by someone who was not normal. There were ink stains and fingernail marks pressed deep beside the words. Sherry froze. She went to the bathroom, locked the door, and turned on the water. Not to shower, but to cry. The sound of running water was an excuse for Chris not to hear the sobs in her throat. She looked at herself in the mirror, dark circles under her eyes, gaunt cheeks. She didn't resemble the woman who used to laugh in the yard 3 months ago. "Something is creeping into this house, and I don't know how to push it out." When she came out of the room, she didn't say anything, but her eyes had changed from fear to vigilance. It was when the motherly instinct in her overcame the role of the wife. She gave the letter to Chris. This time he didn't hide it. He just took it, sat down in a chair, and stared at the paper. "How many letters like this have there been?" she asked. "2, Chris replied, his eyes not leaving the letter. "And you didn't tell me?" "I thought it was just a joke. I didn't want you to be scared." Sherry gave a dry laugh. "A joke? My name and the children's names are in it, Chris. They know the children's names. They know everything." Chris stood up, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain to look outside. The evening was fading. The neighborhood was empty. Everything seemed normal, too normal to be scary. That evening, Sherry went online to buy new door locks, the kind with motion sensors and automatic alarms. She ordered extra mini cameras and stuck anti-theft device stickers on every window. Chris sat watching TV, pretending to concentrate. But the sound of his wife typing on the keyboard, the sound of taping, the sound of opening each drawer, all felt like needles pricking his back. When she sat down beside him, without turning to look, she said softly, "I feel like someone is watching us every night." Her voice was light, without accusation, without fear. Just the stark truth of a woman who knew she was losing the sense of security she once had. Chris didn't respond. He didn't know what to say either. In his mind at this time, the image of the last letter kept appearing. The names of his wife and children lying starkly among the curses. He was no longer sure if this was just a joke, and if it wasn't, what was he fighting against? For the first time in 9 years as a father, Chris skipped reading to his children. "Dad's a little tired today. I'll make it up tomorrow," he said, his eyes not leaving the phone screen. Garrett looked up, surprise clear on his face. Gavin started to beg, but Sherry gently squeezed her son's shoulder and said, "Let Dad rest. Mom will read to you today." She looked at Chris for a long time after that, not angrily, just quietly observing, as if looking for something in her husband's eyes, but not finding it. Chris stood up and left the room without another word. Sherry began to feel that everything was slipping out of control, not noisily, not falling apart, but in a silent and gradual way, like a crack in wood, slowly spreading, without a sound. She couldn't remember the last time Chris had really laughed with her. Not the polite kind of laugh, but the real laugh, relieved, like in the early years of their marriage. Recently, all his words were only to answer. No more starting conversations. No more sharing. Sherry began to do what she thought she would never do. Wait until her husband was fast asleep, then take his phone, unlocking it with his fingerprint. She quickly scrolled through messages, calls, emails, and social media. Nothing unusual, nothing special either. That was what worried her. A husband who used to say everything was now empty. Not hiding anything, but not sharing anything either. Not lying, but no longer intimate. She didn't know what was worse, being betrayed or being ignored to the point of becoming invisible. The next afternoon, Garrett came home from school, took off his backpack, and asked, "Is Dad home yet, Mom?" "Not yet." "Why?" The boy shrugged. "I don't know. These days I see Dad sitting in the car for a long time before coming into the house. Sometimes he sits there for half an hour." Sherry stood still. She went to the porch, sat down on the stone bench, and looked out at the road in front of the house. The trees were still quiet. Birds still flew by. But the feeling inside her had changed, from wondering to doubting. She didn't know if she was living with the same man, or just the shell that man had left behind. That night, Chris went out. He said he was going to buy some things for the organization, but he came home more than 2 hours late. Sherry guessed where he had gone. The next morning, she found a small folded piece of paper in his laundry. The paper was printed with the words, "New Light Chapel," the church in town. Sherry wasn't a religious person, but she understood that the church was where Chris turned to when he needed something beyond his control. She had seen him kneeling there after his father's funeral. The most recent time was when Sherry had a miscarriage 5 years ago. This time, he didn't tell her. He didn't let her know either. Actually, Chris wasn't praying for anything specific. He was just sitting alone in the back row, his eyes looking at the crucifix hanging high above, the golden light shining down from the stained glass window. His eyes were red and puffy from stress and exhausted to the point of collapse. In his head were a series of unanswered questions. Who sent those letters? Did they know what school his children went to? How many people were watching him? And most importantly, what could he keep in this family if he continued to be silent? Chris didn't cry, but his hands clenched until they were white, as if just letting go would cause everything to collapse. That night, Sherry left a small note on his pillow. No frills, no tears. Just a line written carefully. "If you're hiding something, tell me. I don't need a brave man. I need an honest husband." She didn't expect an answer. She didn't place any hope, but she needed to write it down. Otherwise, all the thoughts in her head would suffocate her. The next morning, Chris saw the note. He read it in silence. He didn't tear it up. He didn't throw it away. He folded it carefully, tucking it into his wallet, the second compartment, where he used to keep wedding photos and the first ultrasound of Garrett. All that day, Chris didn't mention the note. But in the evening, when he got into the car to go to work the night shift, he opened his wallet and looked at the line again. For the first time in weeks, his eyes welled up. Not because he was being blamed, but because for the first time he felt Sherry was really drifting away from him. During dinner, Garrett talked about school, but his voice was absent-minded. Gavin ate less than usual. Sherry looked at her 2 children, then at Chris's empty chair. No laughter, no stories, no father who used to be the anchor. The knock came at 3 a.m., sharp and decisive, startling Chris in the middle of his shift. 2 police officers walked into the narrow hallway of the church. Their faces said it all. His heart pounded. "Are you Chris Coleman?" "Yes." "What's wrong?" One of them quietly took out a photo. In the photo was the door of his house, wide open, glass broken, the lights of the room flickering like in a B-rated horror movie. "Your wife has been injured. The 2 children have disappeared from the scene." Chris froze. The familiar house was now strangely frightening. Police officers strung up yellow tape, the flashing red lights blinking in front of the porch, where Sherry used to grow chrysanthemums. Now there were only a few overturned pots of soil. Sherry had been taken to the hospital in an unconscious state. There was a deep bruise on her forehead, as if she had been hit hard with a blunt object. A few strands of bloody hair were matted behind her neck. The walls of the living room were splattered with red paint, scrawled with huge letters. God has chosen. Blood will wash away the lie. Chris stood in the middle of the room, his shoes covered in mud, his eyes frozen. An officer approached, his voice deep. "You should come to the station. There are a few things we need to ask." The interrogation lasted nearly 5 hours. The room was closed, the white lights shining in his face, the air so cold that Chris's hands were icy. "You said you were working at the church from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m.? "Yes, there's a shift record." There were no signs of forced entry, no broken doors, no alarms went off. The lock inside wasn't broken either. "Do you have a spare key?" "Yes, but it's always on the shelf, everyone knows." The officer took notes, then looked straight into his eyes. "You used to be a soldier. You received special training. You understand how to stage a scene, right?" Chris didn't answer, not because he was surprised, but because he had imagined it when he saw the red words on the wall. Who would want to hurt your family? An old flame? A personal enemy? A religious fanatic? Chris shook his head. "I don't know. I don't think anyone would want to do that to Sherry, to the kids." The officer was silent. Then he took a sip of his cold coffee and stood up. Before leaving the room, he said something as if by accident, but as sharp as a thin blade. "You know, sometimes the devil wears the face of a saint. God doesn't send threatening letters, but people can." Clearly, Chris had fallen on the list of suspects, but he didn't resist, he didn't defend himself, because the most important thing to him now was the condition of his wife and children. As Chris left the station, it was daylight. The pale sun covered the roof of the police car, but in his heart, it was still night. He didn't go home. He couldn't. That house was now a crime scene. Sherry was still in the recovery room. The 2 children, he didn't know where. Not a word. Not a cry. The silence was like a deep hole that he fell forever without hitting the bottom. Chris went to the house of the neighboring couple, where there were security cameras. Mrs. Marlene, her hand trembling, opened her laptop, letting him review the recordings from the past few days. Nothing unusual. Until Chris stopped at a blurred image. An old car parked close to the curb in front of his house at nearly 2 a.m., the night of the incident. The license plate wasn't clear. The car was dark-colored. It seemed to have appeared several times in the previous nights. "I didn't notice," Mrs. Marlene whispered. "I just thought it was someone visiting the neighbors." Chris nodded, silent. His head was spinning, but his eyes suddenly sharpened. He zoomed in on the image, trying to recognize any features. That afternoon, Chris was allowed to return to the scene with supervision. He went through each room, each trace, each small corner became a silent accusation. He stopped at the back exit. The floor was still marked with muddy footprints. The police had taken pictures, but no one had noticed a small detail. The shoes were bigger than Chris's shoe size. Chris looked at the footprints for a long time. His eyes narrowed. His hand trembled, but for the first time since everything had happened, his heart had a small anchor. Not me. Not only I knew the way in. A few hours later, Chris sat back in the car, not starting the engine. He opened his wallet, took out the note that Sherry had left him the day before. "I don't need a brave man. I need an honest husband." He closed his eyes. Her words echoed through layers of mixed memories. The sound of children laughing, the sound of calling Dad, the sound of Sherry making tea early in the morning, the smell of dinner still lingering in the kitchen. Everything used to be normal, but now, everything was slipping out of his hands like sand through his fingers. Never in his life had Chris felt so innocent, yet so isolated. The people investigating him didn't know the truth, but even Sherry, would she still believe him? Chris sat in the car for nearly an hour before entering his mother's old house. It was still the simple wooden house with a low porch, peeling paint, and a rickety swing hanging on one side. It was still the steps where he and Ronnie used to sit playing in the dirt when they were little. but everything was fading, like the memory of his brother that had been removed from this family's life. Chris's mother opened the door with a surprised look. She had aged a lot since the last time they met. Her hair was completely white, her back was slightly hunched, but her eyes were still sharp as ever. "What is it, Chris? I didn't hear you were coming home. I just wanted to ask you something. About Ronnie." She paused. She didn't invite him into the house. She didn't ask any more questions. She just stood blocking the door, as if the name itself was something that wasn't allowed to cross this threshold. "Don't dig up that stuff again. It's a disgrace to this family." Chris swallowed hard. "Mom, I didn't come to blame you. I just need to know where he is. I think maybe Ronnie is related to what's happening." Her eyes twitched slightly. "So now you're turning around and blaming him again?" "No. I just need the truth. You're the last person who had contact with him." His mother pursed her lips tightly. Then she stepped back inside, not inviting him in, just calling out, "The last time I heard his voice was 2 years ago. He called to ask me for some money for rehab. I said to him, 'I don't want to hear your voice anymore, Ronnie. I just want peace.' Then I hung up. Since then, I haven't seen him." Chris stood there as if slapped. He didn't know how to react. He didn't have the right to blame anyone either, because he himself didn't even remember the last time he looked Ronnie in the eye. His mother didn't say anything more. She just closed the door. On the way back, Chris stopped the car on the side of the road, under an old tree by the river. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't light a cigarette. He just sat in silence. In his head, his mother's voice echoed, "He's a disgrace to this family." That sentence was like a knife cutting into the past. For years, Chris had used silence to collude in erasing his brother from their shared life. Every time he talked about his family to outsiders, Chris only said, "I'm an only child," and gradually, he believed it too. Chris drove to the rehab center 40 minutes from town, the place Ronnie had been to and had also left. The on-duty staff, a man about Chris's age, looked up when he heard him ask for Ronnie. "Ronnie Coleman? Yeah, I remember someone with that name. He was here about 2 years ago, in and out constantly. He even ran away in the middle of a rainy night once." "When was the last time?" Chris asked. "The last time? Oh, I remember. He sat alone for a long time in the yard, drawing something on the wall with a marker, just muttering, 'God doesn't choose me.' That night, he left. I haven't seen him since." Chris went to the backyard. The wall was covered with moss. But when he bent closer, he saw an old ink stain left, faded by the sun and rain, but still readable. "Who does God choose?" The writing was crooked, but eerily familiar. The slanted handwriting like when Ronnie was little, when he wrote in his diary with a pencil or left silly notes on the refrigerator door. Chris touched the words. His hand trembled. The past seemed to be torn open. Images flooded back. Ronnie crying behind the house because he got a bad grade. Ronnie standing outside the classroom window looking in. Ronnie sitting in the back of his car, always bowing his head, silent. Every detail pieced together, like the echo of someone who had been left behind. 2 days later, Chris received a package with no name sent to work. The receptionist gave it to him with an apologetic look. "No sender. But it looks pretty personal." Chris opened the box. Inside was an envelope. No letter enclosed, just an old photo of 2 boys sitting under a tree. Chris recognized it immediately. It was him and Ronnie, with the same innocent smiles, the same clear eyes looking at the future that hadn't happened yet. But the photo had been torn. Ronnie's face was torn off, torn neatly and deliberately, as if the sender couldn't bear to see himself in the photo anymore. Chris gripped the photo tightly, his heart pounding. His heart was churning. The smell of old paper rose up, making him dizzy. He flipped the back. A line in black ballpoint pen, written carefully in each stroke. "Those who are chosen never need to try." and those who are left behind are never enough. Chris slumped down in his chair. The photo fell to the floor. In his head, a nameless question rang out. Could it be you, Ronnie? He held the photo in his hand for a long time, as if afraid that if he let go, everything would vanish. The past, the memories, and even the last belief that he wasn't the one who had abandoned Ronnie. He remembered his 10th birthday, when his parents gave him a new bicycle. Ronnie only received an old book. That night, when everyone was asleep, Chris saw his brother sitting in the dark, holding the book, his eyes unblinking. "Don't you like it?" Chris had asked. Ronnie just smiled. "No, I'm used to it." A fragile smile. And perhaps from that day on, Ronnie had begun to get used to not being chosen. He was just afraid that he had realized it too late, and had let a soul who once called him brother turn into darkness. The abandoned house was on the edge of town, hidden behind bushes taller than a person. No one came around, no address, no cell service. Only the sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the rotting boards and the smell of mold spreading through the air. Garrett and Gavin huddled in a corner, on an old mattress spread temporarily with coats and thin blankets. A flashlight hung by a shoelace from the ceiling emitted a dim light, just enough to see each other's faces. Ronnie sat in the opposite corner, leaning against the wall, his eyes as sunken as the cracks in the peeling plaster. He hadn't slept for 2 nights, not because he was guarding them, but because he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the things he was trying to forget. An old house, a name that had been erased, a meal with only one portion. Gavin, the 6-year-old, sat up, holding a teddy bear with a torn ear, looking at Ronnie. "Uncle, are you a bad guy?" Ronnie didn't answer. His eyes looked away. His mouth was pursed shut. "At school, I have a friend who was lured by a bad guy. But you're not like that. You don't yell, you don't hit, you're just sad." Ronnie turned his face to the wall, his hand clenched, his fingernails digging into his palm until it turned red. Just sad. Those 2 words. Why did they make his chest tighten like this? On the 3rd night, Garrett sat close to his brother, beginning to tell the story of the boy who cried wolf, without a book, just from memory. There was a boy who kept joking that there was a wolf, but no one believed him. One day, the wolf really came, and the boy cried out, but people still thought it was a joke. Gavin snuggled into his brother's chest. Then what happened? No one saved the boy, but he wasn't a bad person. He just wanted someone to believe him once. Ronnie heard that sentence. His heart tightened. He shivered slightly. The image of the boy in the story strangely matched him. The child who had begged to be seen, who had cried out in every way, then gradually became the noise that people wanted to turn off. "I just want someone to believe me once," Ronnie yelled in the night, not aiming at anyone. No one heard. It was just himself, for the first time saying what he had swallowed for nearly 30 years. Near dawn, Ronnie went to the back of the house, where there was only weeds and a broken wall. He lit a cigarette, took a puff, then put it out immediately. Not because he was afraid of a fire, but because he hated the smell of smoke. The smell always reminded him of his father, the man who smoked cigarettes constantly in the kitchen, drinking alcohol and cursing, "You're a waste of space. You were born a mistake." He looked up at the sky, pale, no stars. Only a piece of memory suddenly surfaced. His mother's voice, on the day Ronnie failed his final exam. "I wish I only had one child. At least that child would be something to be proud of." Ronnie used to think that the sentence would drift away like so many others, but it never left his head. It was a knife. At first, it was just stuck in lightly. Then, every year, every month, it twisted another turn. "I don't want to be the bad guy. I just want someone to come back and find me." Ronnie screamed in the night, not aimed at anyone. No one heard. It was just himself. for the first time saying what he had swallowed for nearly 30 years. That noon, Ronnie returned to the room. The two children were still asleep. Garrett was lying on his side, his arm around his brother like a little father. Ronnie sat down opposite them, his hand trembling as he placed it on the teddy bear that Gavin was hugging. He touched the torn ear lightly, then let go. In that moment, he didn't see two hostages. He saw himself, a thin child who used to sleep curled up in a cramped room, always imagining that someone would knock on the door, come in, hug him, and say, "Ronnie, you're not invisible. You're part of this family." But that door never opened, until now. Ronnie sat leaning against the wall, his hands clutching his head. His chest was heaving. He whispered, almost praying, not to God, but to the human part that was left in him. "They shouldn't be here. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to be seen. I just want him to come back." Each word spoken as if drawing every breath from his lungs. His eyes were no longer fierce, but sunken, lost, like a person lost in his own mistakes. In the evening, when Garrett woke up, Ronnie brought the boy an old box of milk from the box of belongings. The boy thanked him, and for the first time called him, "Uncle, are you okay?" Ronnie paused. It had been a long time since he had received any concerns, even the smallest. He turned away, his eyes stinging. That night, he didn't lock the door. He just placed a chair in front of the exit, like a fragile compromise between freedom and control. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know how everything would end. But he knew the only thing that kept him from sliding completely into darkness was the two children who were sleeping there. Not because he loved them, but because in their eyes, for the first time, he wasn't a monster. The GPS signal from the children's watch, the birthday gift Chris had given Garrett, finally went off. It was an important tool to find out the location of the children. But Chris did not want to alert the police from the beginning, and now he did not want to tell the police. He knew if he let someone else go in first, there would be danger. And if that happened, everything would end. Not just a life, but also the last chance to save what was left between the two brothers. He drove through the night, his hands gripping the steering wheel until they were numb, his heart beating wildly because he didn't know who he was about to face. A madman, a lost soul, or a younger brother who used to sit behind his bicycle, hugging him tightly, not daring to look up. On the way to the house, Chris stopped for a moment on the side. He took out his phone, intending to call Sherry, then turned off the screen. He didn't know what to say. That he was about to step into where? That he might not come out? Or that perhaps the person holding their children was not a stranger, but a shadow from their own family, a part they had chosen to forget. He folded the phone, swallowed, and said to himself, "Whatever is waiting inside must be ended by me." When the car stopped in front of the abandoned house, the cold wind blew through the field of withered grass. No lights, no sound, only a dim light flickering from the crack in the door. Chris got out, each step as if stepping on the past. He pushed the door open. The sound of the hinge creaked slowly, shuddering as if trying to warn. This place was no longer a shelter. Inside, two children were huddled in a corner. Gavin hugged his older brother tightly, his eyes wide in terror. Garrett saw his father, intending to run to him, but stopped because of what was appearing in the middle of the room. Ronnie, holding a gasoline can, his face contorted, his eyes bloodshot. The smell of gasoline filled the room. The floor was speckled with wet patches. Just one spark, and everything would be ashes. The moment Chris's eyes met the children's, he almost burst into tears. Not because of fear, but because for so many days he had never dared to imagine if he would see them again. Gavin saw his father, his voice sobbing. "Dad." Chris nodded, raising his hand. "Dad's here." "It's okay, son." But his eyes remained fixed on Ronnie, as if just a second of distraction could turn everything to dust. Ronnie pointed at Chris, his voice hoarse. "Step back. I swear, if you take another step, I'll light it." Chris didn't flinch, not afraid, not angry. He just looked at Ronnie. For the first time, not with the eyes of a brother or someone with guilt, but with a look that truly saw a human being who had been forgotten. "I didn't come to arrest you. I came to really see you. For the first time." Ronnie laughed like he was going crazy. "See me? Do you know who I am? I'm the shadow. I'm the mistake. I'm the part that makes you look better in everyone's eyes." "You're my brother," Chris replied, each word slow and deliberate. Ronnie screamed, "Don't ever call me that." "Have you ever really called me brother? When you went into the army, the whole family was proud. When I failed graduation, the whole family was silent. You're the model son. I'm the reason Mom cries in secret." "I know," Chris said, his voice trembling. "And that's my fault," Chris said. "I chose silence. I let you be swallowed by loneliness while I received the applause. I let you die slowly in a dark corner, not because I hated you, but because I forgot you. Brother, I'm truly sorry for that." Ronnie paused. The hand holding the lighter wavered. Gavin began to sob. Garrett gripped his brother's hand tightly. Everything in the room went silent for a beat, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Chris took a step forward. "I'm not apologizing to make you forgive me. I'm saying it because you need to know. I need you, and the whole family needs you. Not because of guilt, but because I don't want these two kids to grow up carrying the wounds that you had to carry." Ronnie was shaking. His eyes were teary. He gasped, his voice breaking. "I don't want to do this. I just want someone to see me. Not see me to pity me, but see me to need me." Chris took another step. His eyes were red. "Ronnie, the whole family needs you. Come back." Ronnie looked at the two children, then looked down at the gasoline can. His eyes were no longer those of a madman, but the eyes of a child who had been left behind, and finally had someone come back to find him. His hand released the can. The lighter fell to the floor without igniting. He knelt down, screaming, as if releasing 30 years of repression in a scream that no one heard. Chris stepped forward, kneeling down, not scolding, not questioning, just hugging Ronnie tightly, as if he had just found the part of himself that he had lost for a lifetime. They both knelt in the middle of the room, filled with the smell of gasoline and mold. Chris held his brother tight, and Ronnie let the tears run down his cheeks, no longer hiding them. Chris put his hand on the back of Ronnie's neck, the way he used to do when comforting him after a beating from their father. "You've never been invisible, Ronnie. It's just that I was too busy proving myself, that I forgot you were always there. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Ronnie didn't answer, but over Chris's shoulder, his head nodded slightly, like a nod from a child, finally hearing what he had waited a lifetime to believe. The door behind them burst open. Police officers rushed in. An officer raised his gun, shouting, "Hands up! Get down! Quick!" Chris didn't resist. He spread his arms, blocking Ronnie, then slowly turned around. "Ronnie has surrendered. Don't do anything stupid." The officer hesitated, then lowered his gun. Garrett ran to his father, sobbing. Chris hugged his son, then looked at Ronnie, who was cowering like a child, his hands covering his face, his whole body trembling. No one gave orders. No one needed to say anything more. As he was being taken to the police car, Ronnie didn't resist. He turned his head back to look at his brother, his lips moving. He didn't say it, but Chris understood. "Thank you for coming." Chris nodded, slowly, very slowly, but definitely. Because if he didn't come, who would? The nightlight in Sherry's room stayed on for 3 weeks straight. No one mentioned it. But every night, when the soft golden light spilled out from the crack in the door, it was like an invisible milestone signaling that everything wasn't really calm yet. Chris didn't ask. He just turned off the hallway light, walked quietly into the room, lay next to Sherry, and gently touched his hand to his wife's back. Sherry didn't turn around, but he felt her breathing become more even. She knew he was there, and sometimes a silent presence was the most healing medicine. Sherry also started having light sleepwalking episodes. Some nights, Chris woke up to find his wife standing by the window, her eyes open but vacant, her hands gripping Gavin's old teddy bear tightly. He would walk over, gently touch his wife's shoulder, and lead her back to bed without saying anything. The next morning, Sherry didn't remember anything. But from that day on, Chris put paper on all the glass, so that even if Sherry didn't say it, he would make her feel safer. Garrett returned to school after 2 weeks. Gavin was still easily startled at night, but he didn't cry anymore. He hugged his old teddy bear tightly, and when Chris walked into the room every night, Gavin just reached out to hold his hand to sleep. One Sunday afternoon, Garrett was sitting drawing at his desk. Chris walked by, intending to ask his son if he needed anything, but stopped when he saw the picture. 4 people, 3 standing close together. Dad, Mom, Gavin. The 4th, Uncle Ronnie, standing in the right corner, further away, smaller but still clear. Garrett had even written the names below each person, carefully, not misspelling a word. That afternoon, when Chris was washing the car, Garrett came near again, holding the picture, not saying anything, just standing looking at his father. "What do you see in this picture?" Chris asked. Garrett bit his lip, thinking for a moment. "There's someone standing far away, because they're not ready to come closer. But if we stand too close, they might run away. So I drew Uncle Ronnie far away. So if he wants to come closer, he knows we won't chase him away, because he's family too." Chris bit his lip tightly. He bowed his head and gently kissed his son's hair. For the first time in many days, his eyes stung with hope, not fear. That night, after the 2 children were asleep, Chris opened his laptop. He wrote a letter. Not long, no justification, no sermonizing. "Ronnie, I'm not sure I've ever been a good brother. I chose to forget, because I thought forgetting was a relief. But now I know. Forgetting is killing off bit by bit what was once truly family. I won't promise anything big. Just that, if you're ready, then from now on, I'm here. Doing the right role that I should have done a long time ago." He signed his name simply, Chris. Not your brother, not blood relative, just Chris. Close enough, but also humble enough. Nearly a month later, a reply arrived. Pale yellow paper, the handwriting stiff and slow, as if Ronnie had sat for a long time before writing. "I'm not sure if I'm ready. I'm still scared, not because of the prison, but because I'm afraid if I come out, there'll be nothing waiting for me. But at least now I know there's someone waiting. That's all. Enough to see I haven't lost everything." Chris read it over and over, not smiling, not crying. He just quietly folded the letter and put it in the drawer, where he used to keep the old photo of him and Ronnie when they were 10 years old. Now, that drawer had another piece of the past, no longer a past to forget, but something to keep. Before folding the letter, Chris stuck a sticky note on the edge of the re-glued photo of the 2 brothers. Just a small line. "To Ronnie, if you come back, sit here." Below was the old wooden chair opposite the desk. No one was sitting there. But from that day on, Chris always kept it dust-free. Sherry never asked Chris anything about that day. Not about what happened in the abandoned house. Not about what Chris had said to keep Ronnie from doing something foolish. She didn't need to, because she saw in the way her husband hugged his children, quietly cleared the table, or put Garrett's clock back on the shelf. Something had changed. Not noisy, not flashy, but enough for her to know. He was putting back the broken pieces. That night, when Chris was about to turn off the nightlight, Sherry said, "Don't turn it off. I think it's okay if we sleep with some light." Chris nodded. He didn't ask any more questions, but his hand gently took Sherry's hand under the blanket. For the first time in many days, her hand didn't pull away. That weekend, as Sherry was writing in her journal, she paused for a long time before writing the first line. "The wounds don't disappear. They just change places, lying still in a person's heart like a small stone, every now and then stirring up waves. But family makes it no longer a permanent cut. If there is anyone patient enough to listen, to come back, to take the hand of someone thought beyond saving, then even just for a second it's worth it. She closed the journal, putting it back on the bedside table. This time, there was no sigh. Chris opened the old cabinet. In it was the album with the worn spine. The old photo, where he and Ronnie sat together under the tree, had been re-glued on the back with tape. No longer torn, no longer ripped. He put the photo in a frame, placing it right on the corner of the desk, where the morning light shone in every day. Not to look back at the past, but to remind himself that once you choose to see each other, no one is invisible. Spring touched the doorstep with warm breezes and small petals falling all over the yard. Sherry said, it had been a long time since the whole family had gone anywhere far, and far here was simply a green meadow behind the trees at the edge of town, where there was no cell service, no LED lights, nothing but a blanket, a picnic basket, and the people you don't need to record to remember. Chris smiled and agreed. He didn't ask why. He just nodded and put a few simple things in the car. Sandwiches, apple juice, a ball, and the old children's book that Gavin still liked. They arrived around 10 a.m. The meadow was wide. The sun was light. No one was there but their family. Garrett ran out first, like a squirrel escaping its cage, his arms spread wide to welcome the wind. Gavin lagged behind a little, holding Sherry's hand, his eyes wary but curious. Chris sat down, spreading his arms wide and taking a deep breath. For the first time in many months, he didn't need to be vigilant. He didn't feel like someone was watching. "No photos, no phones, Dad," Garrett said loudly, like a tacit rule set for the day. "No phones, no photos," Chris repeated, then raised his hand to swear. "Just bring a heart." Garrett started picking wildflowers growing close to the edge of the forest. None of the flowers were beautiful, but they all had a simple, charming look. The boy brought the small bouquet back, gave it to his mother, and said as if it were a prepared sentence, "I don't need photos. I remember with my heart." Sherry paused. She clenched the bouquet in her hand as if clenching her own heart that was throbbing, not because of pain, but because of the purity and gentleness that her own child was teaching her again, after all the past panics. Lunch was cold sandwiches, fruit juice, and laughter. Gavin was smeared with apple juice, crawled onto the blanket, then looked up at the sky for a long time. Then he asked, "Later, can Uncle Ronnie go on picnics too?" The question fell like a silent petal, weightless, but making everyone pause. Sherry turned to Chris. Chris just smiled. Sherry stroked her son's hair, then looked into the distance. She didn't answer. Because there are questions that don't need answers. Just needing the listener to keep it in their heart for a long time is enough. No one said more, but the whole family sat a little closer together. Sherry's hand touched Chris's hand. Garrett leaned his head on his mother's shoulder. Gavin was silent, watching the sun shining through the canopy of trees and closing his eyes. Chris left the group for a moment, walking to the end of the meadow, where there was a large tree and cool shade. He sat down, tilted his head back, and looked up at the sky. There was nothing special up there, just a few lazy clouds, but in his eyes, something seemed to be returned. Peace. He remembered the feeling of being tense in front of the police recorder, the sound of his children crying in a nightmare, the suspicious look of his wife. All of that was no longer here. Now there was only wind, clouds, sun, and a family, maybe still with cracks, but no longer broken. That evening, when they got home, Chris found a new letter in the mailbox. Ronnie. The handwriting was still the same, stiff, slanted, and slightly offset. He sat in the office, opening it. "Today I told a story to my roommate. He didn't laugh, but he didn't cry either. I think that's okay. I haven't dared to think about later, but if you still keep that chair at home, then I'll try to one day sit in it." Chris put the letter down, leaning back in his chair. Then he turned to look at the wooden chair in the corner of the room, still empty but dust-free, as if waiting for someone. And for the first time, he didn't see it as empty, but saw it waiting. No words, no promises, no obligations, just a handshake, holding each other with heart. The prison in the suburbs was surrounded by high walls, barbed wire, and cameras silently turning their heads to observe. Chris had seen this place on the news, never thinking he would step inside as a relative. He went through 3 layers of doors, presented his papers, left his phone, signed the record. The young officer said quietly as he handed over the pass, "You're the first relative to visit that prisoner." Chris just nodded, not answering. Ronnie was waiting by the iron table, his hands resting on his lap, his eyes looking down. The baggy prison uniform made him look smaller, more outdated, as if the whole person had been soaked in water for a long time and then squeezed dry of all resistance. Chris sat down opposite him. They looked at each other, not long, not hurried. There was no glass fence between them, just a space far enough away for each side to decide to move forward or not. Ronnie spoke first, his voice hoarse from not talking for a long time. "Are you angry?" Chris nodded. "Yes, I'm angry. Angry that you hurt Sherry, scared Garrett and Gavin. Angry that I had to watch you turn into someone else." Ronnie swallowed, not refuting. "But..." Chris looked straight at him. "We're brothers." Ronnie paused, not looking up right away, but the 2 hands on his lap began to shake lightly. They didn't say much. There was no emotional confession. No one cried out loud. The conversation was just simple, broken sentences. About the food in the camp. About Ronnie starting to read books again. The first book was The Kite Runner. About Ronnie being assigned to take care of the plants in the backyard. The plants were still alive, even though he wasn't good at watering them evenly. "I dropped the pot once. I almost got banned from going outside." Chris chuckled softly. "You're still clumsy like when you were little." Ronnie shook his head, his lips smiling, for the first time in a long time. Before leaving, Chris placed a small envelope on the table. "This is for you. No money, nothing valuable, just ... Ronnie opened it. Inside was a new photo, Chris's family. Sherry sat between the 2 children. Chris stood behind, his hand gently on his wife's shoulder. On the left side of the photo, a small blank space was written by hand with black ink. "Uncle Ronnie will come back when ready." Ronnie didn't say anything, just looking for a long time, not crying. But his eyes lit up. Not because he was too emotional, but because it was the first time in his life he saw that he truly had a place in a photo that didn't have his face torn off. Chris stood up, preparing to leave the room. Ronnie looked up. "Will you come again?" Chris replied without hesitation. "Every month, unless you're sick of my face." Ronnie smiled, this time out loud. The following week, Garrett submitted an essay in class. The topic was, "My family." The teacher told Sherry when she came to pick up her son. Garrett wrote very maturely, not like a 9-year-old. He wrote, "Our family has 5 people. One person is learning how to start over, and we will always be there to help." Sherry had to stop for a few seconds after reading that, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too clearly. That night, Chris posted his son's essay on the refrigerator, right under the photo that he had just printed out again. The photo still had Uncle Ronnie in the small white space on the left. The name was not left out, no longer a hazy shadow, but a part that was clearly written, kind and present. That weekend, Sherry wrote in her journal again. Not much, just 3 lines. "No one is born ready to be loved, but everyone deserves to be waited for. If we don't hold on to the person we once neglected, who will?" The next day, Chris brought a new pot of flowers to the camp, the kind that was easy to live, not needing to be watered often, not needing much sun. The officer took the tree saying, "Someone will really like it." Chris nodded, then turned away. Before passing through the iron gate, he turned back to look at the high wall behind him, not with pity, but with determination. Because there are people we can't save, but we can hold them back, with patience, with faith, and with family. No need to be noble. Just don't let go.